This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
So I'd like to welcome you to this very interesting event. This is a very big event in world history. The 60th anniversary of the formation of the PRC is a very big event. And I think we know a lot about big events in world history at IRPS because it's big events that have shaped the creation of IRPS and kept it going since that happened. It's hard to imagine now. IRPS was formally created in 1986. Do you remember the world of 1986? The world of 1986 was a rapidly rising Japan, an American economy in trouble, competition with Germany and Japan, a flood of foreign imports, Rust Belt, factories closing. And IRPS was formed in response to that as a desire to get the world thinking more about the Pacific region, less about Europe and the Atlantic, and more about Asia Pacific and Latin America. And of course, things rapidly started to change after that. Do you remember that not long after that, the Soviet Union collapsed, the regimes of Eastern Europe unraveled, and China began its extraordinary path to growth. And not only China, but India, Indonesia, Brazil, a new set of arrangements happening. But I think that what's most preoccupying to us and of interest is the great rise of China, the extraordinary growth of China, I think, and what that means for the world, the tremendous shift of issues that poses about foreign policy, the United States and Chinese relations, China's relationship to its neighbors, to Africa, to the world economy, the flow of Chinese money into the United States. We all know it. I don't have to repeat it, but that is the extraordinary thing that fascinates us, and I think that's something to which our school is very devoted to developing and making a commitment to an understanding of China and working on that. So it's all the more appropriate for us to have this panel about the rise of China. How did it happen? What got us from 1949 to today, and what that means for the world. So having said that, let me formally introduce our very distinguished panel of speakers. I'd like to begin with Susan Shirk, who's the person to my right, who's the holder of the Ho Mulam Chair in China and Pacific Relations. And that's in honor of Marion So, who is sitting right over there. Susan is the director of IGCC, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Clinton years in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, founder and leader of the Northeast Asia Cooperation Dialogue, a Track 2 forum, and the author of numerous books, perhaps too numerous for me to mention, but one of them is How China Opened Its Door, and most recently, or one that's attracted quite a lot of attention, is called China, Fragile Superpower. Susan serves on many boards and organizations. She has a PhD from MIT, and I first met her many, many, many years ago with her husband, Sam Popkin, when we were all graduate students and young in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Next is, sitting over on the other side of Susan is Barry Naughton, an economist specializing in China, holder of the So Kwan Look Chair of Chinese Studies. So Kwan Look is sitting with us also. Barry has a PhD in economics from Yale. He's an internationally known expert on China's economy. He's an author of a lot of books on how China evolved from a planned economy to a market economy, including Growing Out of the Plan, Reforming Asian Socialism. And he's an author of a very important book on China, Chinese economy, transitions, and growth. Barry teaches courses on doing business in China and globalization, world systems in the Pacific. Right to the right of Susan is Professor Richard Madsen, professor of sociology here at UCSD. Distinguished professor at UCSD, and I want to say that he was a member of the original planning committee that was formed in 1985 to help create the school. So he's one of the several. What are you, a godfather or a godparent? I'm not sure exactly, but Dick and I got to know each other in those days, helping get the school going back 25 years ago. Dick has a PhD in sociology at Harvard. He's author of 11 books on Chinese culture. He might be most famous for a book which isn't about China, which is that he wrote with Robert Bellah called Habits of the Heart, which won lots of prizes. But he's written quite a lot of books on China, morality and power in a Chinese village, amongst them. A book on China's Catholics and a book on Chinese theory. He gives courses on Chinese society and transition and is one of the key figures in UCSD's China program for many, many years. And then sitting between Dick and Barry is Tai-Ming Chung, Associate Research Scientist at IGCC, an Associate Adjunct Professor at IRPS, a PhD from King's College in the UK, spent 2 years at Beijing University, and has a BA from Sussex. Tai-Ming is running a project on technology and national security in China, innovation, defense, and China's place in the global technology order. He manages the Northeast Asia Cooperation Dialogue with Susan, the Track 2 dialogue that I mentioned, introducing Susan, and he is doing a project with Tokyo University in Yonsei in Korea, funded by the MacArthur Program. His latest book is called Fortifying China, The Struggle to Build a Modern Defense University, published by Cornell in 2009, and he's teaching courses here for us on Asia security, Chinese politics, and China security and technology. So that's a pretty distinguished panel. They're going to each talk for a few minutes and have a conversation amongst them. And Dr. Shirk is going to moderate the panel, so it's my very great pleasure to introduce our really fantastic team of Chinese scholars here at IRPS and UCSD who are the foundations of a future China program and an existing one. Susan.
Well, thank you very much. Peter Gurevich is, of course, the founding dean of our school, and now he is acting while our current dean, Peter Cowie, serves the public interest working in the Obama administration in Washington. But Peter Cowie will be back in January. First of all, this is a wonderful occasion, and I'd like to congratulate all our Chinese friends here on the 60th anniversary of their country. So, gongxi, gongxi. You know, I first went to China in 1971, and so that's the virtue of getting on in years and having a lot of experience in China. So I really have seen what the Chinese people have built and accomplished, and I'm sure everyone here has tremendous admiration and respect for the accomplishments of all the Chinese people in building such a modern society and economy. But tonight we're going to step back and be analytical. It's not a pep rally, and it's not the National Day parade. Instead, we're going to step back and be a little analytical and consider how and why this political system, the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, has managed to survive so long. 60 years. It survived the violent chaos of the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. It survived the death of its founder, Mao Zedong, and charismatic leader in 1976. And it has survived all the dramatic changes in Chinese society that have been brought about by the market reform and opening that were introduced in 1978. China today, it's pretty clear to me, and I'm sure clear to many of you who go there, that China today is a very different place than it was in the Mao era. And yet the Chinese Communist Party has adapted to all these changes remarkably well. And that's what we're going to examine tonight. The question is, how have they adapted? What have they done to survive in power? And can they keep it up? So our first speaker is Barry Naughton, who is going to address the economic dimension, which obviously needs to come first because of the success of China's economic reforms. Barry.
Thank you, Susan. It's a huge pleasure to be here, not just on a celebratory occasion, but with this gathering of family and friends. And I just want to start out by saying how touched I am and how pleased I am to have this opportunity for us to all gather and get together. It's been wonderful just sitting here the last half hour and talking to everybody. Let me start with an irony. The great irony of celebrating 60 years of the People's Republic, when you look at it as an economist, is that in China, they spent 30 years building a planned economic system and 30 years dismantling a planned economic system. We're so used to thinking of China as a transitional economy, as a reform economy. It's kind of sobering to realize, gosh, they've been transitioning for 30 years out of a system that it took them 30 years to build. Now, you would think that if you spend the same amount of time dismantling something that you do building something, that you'd have done a pretty effective job. In other words, if you spent 30 years building it up and 30 years taking it apart, you'd pretty much assume by the end of that time that there wasn't very much left. You didn't see very many traces of what you had started off building. But it's not true. Right? When we look at China today, there are still many, many traces of the kind of institutions that began to be built in the 1950s as part of the initial socialist construction of China. Now, of course, that tells us something about the initial socialist construction of China, too, which is that it was initially, at least for a period, a project of national construction that reached beyond the Communist Party, that brought in many people who maybe weren't Communist Party members, people who believed in democracy, people who believed in creating national greatness, people who believed in economic prosperity, and that part of the enormous success of this national project to begin with was precisely the fact that it was a broader and more inclusive project. Then later on, under Mao, under the Cultural Revolution, somehow the nation-building project was more narrowly defined as being a project of the Communist Party and made part of the nation-building activity and the political dominance of the Communist Party. In the years since 1978, so in the 30 years of reform and transition, even though on some level everything has changed, at the same time we still see, as I said, many legacies from the past. One of the peculiar things for me in going to China over these years is how continuously there's a role for planning. People are constantly planning things. They're constantly making long-run projections. There's a sector plan in this sector, that sector, every sector. There's a plan. And half of the time, you look at these plans and you go, they're crazy. It's unrealistic. It's not going to happen. It's not linked to the underlying dynamism of the economy. But that's only half the time. And the other half of the time, you look at it and you realize, wow, there was something in that planning process that helped make this system more responsive, help make it more resilient, help prepare people for changes that maybe in our rather naive American approach we would have said, you can't anticipate, you can't prepare for. And yet somehow this system had laid some foundation for the kind of responses that were necessary. We saw this dramatically last year in November, when the American financial crisis hit, and China was hit badly, much worse than most people think. But somehow there was a toolkit ready. There was, to use the American jargon, there were a lot of spade-ready projects queued up and ready to go, right? And thus, China's response was quick, it was decisive, and it made a difference. Clearly it made a difference to China, but actually in this case, made a difference to the whole world. So it strikes me that one of the things that should be in the back of our mind as we look at all this is, how is it that we simultaneously look at the socialist era in China? Most people look at it as having been a failure, but then we look at the very successful China of the last 30 years, we can't fully disentangle the different parts. And it's a challenge to us to understand how the legacy elements of socialist China are also part of the successful China that we've seen so much in the last 30 years. Success. I think we can use that word without qualification, without hesitation, especially when we look at it from the economic side. So let me start out by saying I think one of the responses we should have to Susan's question, this great question that underlies this panel tonight is, well, of course it's succeeded. Of course the system has had persistence. The system has had persistence because on some level it's delivered the goods. It's an economic success, and we see all over the world that systems that deliver the goods economically tend to persist up to a certain point. So I'm not embarrassed to say, look, let's celebrate the economic success of this system. Now, to be sure, when we talk about economic success, we tend to emphasize the economic growth record. And one thing you could say about China for sure is that the leaders of China focus on relatively narrow definitions of economic growth. And so it could be that we would look at China and find this remarkable focus on growth comes at the expense of other things that are equally important. And certainly there's something there to talk about. There's much to talk about the environment in China, lots of other problems. But before we go there, let's just spend a second thinking about growth within the context of broader-based development. In other words, growth isn't just the growth of output. It's the growth of capabilities that produce the potential to have a better life in the future. In other words, development is the expansion of physical infrastructure, but more importantly, it's the expansion of human capabilities to perform today, but also to adapt and to perform tomorrow. And it seems to me important to mention as we zoom by that when we try and measure those things in China, we see that the growth success is real. In other words, that the Chinese capabilities in terms of education, in terms of a healthy society, in terms even of a society where important questions are discussed and debated, this is something where China's record is almost as good as the quantitative GDP growth rates that are so often the focus of economic discussions. So I'm an optimist, and I think there's much to celebrate in the achievement of China over the past 60 years and 30 years. This achievement, I think, in many respects, brings us to the threshold of something. The threshold of what? Well, I was struck recently, I saw an article that tried to measure happiness in China. Actually, a serious effort. Now, of course, you know, because this is China, you know, in addition to this serious effort I'm going to talk about, there's also a National Statistical Bureau measure of happiness that they're pushing, and they report that happiness has increased. This other measure is not quite so optimistic. It's interesting. What it finds is China's kind of in the middle. Urban China, people are not unhappy, but they're not super happy. They're kind of where you'd expect. They're almost as happy as the French, who of course are always malcontent with their wonderful life and high standard of living, but much higher than poor people, but not at the top. Because there's still a drive to have more, to aspire to better. And there's an undercurrent both of achievement and of dissatisfaction. And that strikes me as being one of the most powerful indicators of where China's going in the future. Of course, you could say, measuring happiness, it's a meaningless number. True. There are lots of other meaningless numbers too. GDP, here's a meaningless number for you. China next year will surpass Japan's GDP to be the second biggest economy in the world. Equally meaningless if it doesn't lead to higher happiness, but somehow meaningful in ways that all of us grasp. Here's one other perhaps meaningless number. China's approaching the point where it will be half urban. We're used to the idea, we've been used to the idea for so long that China was a rural society. We're just getting used to the idea that the largest migration in history is occurring as people leave the countryside and come into the city. Guess what? Now we're going to have to get used to the idea that this migration, this massive migration of people, is coming close to being over. Enough people have left the countryside that there aren't that many young, able-bodied people ready to leave. China's on the threshold of a new type of society. And this new type of society is going to be more urban, much better off, more self-confident, but also older, less dynamic, and more complex. So we celebrate the achievement and also recognize that China's on the threshold of something that may be qualitatively different from what we've seen so far. I better stop there.
Thank you, Barry. Well, I'm the political scientist, so I'm talking about politics. And as I see it, the greatest risk that the Chinese Communist Party has confronted is really the risk at the top of power, not the risks at the bottom. Now, there's a lot of attention paid in the popular media to increasing protests and the potential for instability, for social challenges to party rule from the bottom up. But the Soviet Union and most authoritarian regimes really collapse because of divisions at the top, not because the masses rise up and bring the regime down. Now, China has experienced two really big political crises. And after each of them, it changed the way it manages politics at the top. After the Cultural Revolution, of course, and after Mao died, then the surviving leaders of China, especially Deng Xiaoping, realized that the greatest risk to China moving forward is the rise of another Mao. That out of the Communist Party leadership, you would have another leader who got all the power to himself and became a dictator and could turn on his colleagues and purge them, and also could go off half-cocked and pursue rash ideas like the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution, create chaos and endanger the whole system. So Deng Xiaoping wrote a kind of roadmap for the institutionalization of Communist Party leadership. It's not democracy. Even though in China they call it democracy, but what they mean is something very different than what we think of as democracy. But it does check the power of the individual leader and really has created an oligarchy of collective rule in which current leader Hu Jintao is really just first among equals, and that decisions are made perhaps by consensus, we don't really know for sure, among the 9 members of the Politburo Standing Committee. The other problem, the other crisis, the next crisis, of course, was 1989, Tiananmen. In that year, there were large demonstrations about all sorts of problems in Chinese society, including corruption, but many of the slogans were slogans in favor of democracy. And they were in more than 130 cities throughout China. The People's Republic of China almost ended right then, not just because of the protests, but because the leadership divided on how to respond to the protests, how to manage the protests. And everyone could see that there were two centers, 2 points of view at the very top. And it was based on different political philosophies, but also on a competition for power, as you always have among political leaders. So that division at the top meant that things really almost went out of control, and only because the military, in the end, followed Deng Xiaoping's orders to come and forcibly put down the demonstrations did the regime survive. In that very same year, the Berlin Wall fell, and communist political systems in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union started to disintegrate. So naturally, China's leaders after 1989 have been very worried that their own days in power are numbered, and they have set about making sure that there will be never again those kinds of public leadership splits. They're also, of course, working hard in trying to manage the protests. But if the leadership can hang together publicly, then most protests will fizzle out or be repressed or managed in some way by the Communist Party. So there's not really, in my opinion, any great risk to China from all these protests, so long as the leadership remains publicly united. Now, this is getting harder and harder, though, because this is a very changed society. And of course, these guys at the top, they're politicians. I like to think of them as politicians. And that means they're concerned about their own influence and power. So it could happen anytime, really, that the competition, which certainly exists within them, will erupt and spill over out into the public. I think the media and internet in China make this all the more likely. You know, I'm struck by how amazing it is that in Hong Kong, just over the border, so to speak, from the PRC, that you have a media that reports on what's going on inside the black box of top leadership politics all the time. And sometimes they're probably even right. Some of it is just speculation. But they have sources, they get leaks, and they report on what's going on. In China, that's a taboo. You cannot report on decision-making at the top. You can't search online under a leader's name. So they work so hard to maintain that black box, to keep this public facade of unanimity, despite the fact that we know there must be intense competition. But now there are fixed terms of office, retirement ages, term limits, and this makes the competition more predictable and regular. However, let me just mention something about leadership succession, which of course is the key point at which you could have this competition spill out into the public, the handing over of power from one leader to another. China accomplished what many of us thought could never happen in 2002, 2003, when Jiang Zemin, President Jiang Zemin, stepped down from power and handed over leadership to a new generation of leaders. That had never happened before in any large communist country, that peaceful transition of power. Well, now it should happen again in 2012, when Hu Jintao, we have a norm now that every leader rules for 2 5-year terms. So in 2012, he should hand over power to a new leader. And will it be as smooth? Well, the norm is the leader doesn't get to choose his own successor. And so probably the successor is Xi Jinping, was not Hu Jintao's first choice. But according to the last precedent, he should have been named to the Central Military Commission in preparation to take over in 2012. And this should have happened a couple of weeks ago. And guess what? It didn't happen. And we don't know what this means. It could mean that it's not all laid out, that the competition is still ongoing and it could spill out over into the public. So keep an eye on this, because in my view, how they manage succession and leadership politics is really a crucial, crucial factor in the success and survival up to now, but also the risks for the future. Now I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Dick Mattson, who'll talk about society.
Well, let me say at the outset what a wonderful pleasure and honor it is to be here. As Peter Gervitz said, I was on the committee that sort of helped found this IRPS. And to see it develop this way and to see the China program develop into one of the best in the country is an enormous sense of satisfaction. I'm a sociologist, not a political scientist, and so I'll just talk from a sociological point of view about ideology and organization in the Chinese Communist Party and about state-society relationships. I spent the almost entire last academic year in China, in Shanghai, teaching at Fudan University as part of the University of California exchange program, and only returned finally about less than 2 weeks ago. So let me talk about these issues in terms of a few stories that convey impressions gleaned from this year in what I hope would be a fairly down-to-earth way. First story relates to ideology and the Chinese Communist Party and its adaptability. I had a student at Fudan, a top student actually in social sciences, who's joining the Communist Party, as indeed most of the students with good grades at a university like Fudan do so by the time that they become seniors. She's in the final stages of joining and was talking about it, and I mentioned to her that, you know, the Communist Manifesto actually is a very interesting document. And she said, "What is the Communist Manifesto?" And so here is someone at one of the best universities in China, a social science major, someone who's actually been studying Marxism ever since elementary school and doesn't know what the communist, haven't heard of the Communist Manifesto. Okay, so this is an indication of the way in which standard Marxist-Leninist ideology has practically no grip on even people in the Communist Party in China. So what holds the party together? How does the party organize itself? What guides it? Well, another anecdote was, as part of my field work and this research project I was doing, I spent a lot of time in one of China's most dynamic cities, sitting around having all these big meals with basic local officials, party members, and local businessmen. And you'd have these huge meals and plenty to drink, and after it they'd go out to the local karaoke club with the hostesses and all that, and do a lot of business there. They said that more business was done in these hostess bars than any other place. I didn't actually go to the bars, but in any case, you got a sense of what the party meant. Almost all of them were party members, of how it was connected with local society and indeed local business and development. So the party, in effect, is something like a networking club now, and you have to join it to get to certain levels. And it's a venue where basically business people, government people, and workers can interact and get together. But the way in practice at that grassroots level it really works is that basically the people in business, entrepreneurs, and government people are the leading forces, not the working class and certainly not the peasantry. So at these lunches, one thing they talked a lot about how they were going to carry out various local development schemes and how they couldn't bother to follow the rules, the laws, because he says these peasants, these farmers, they don't understand law. You have to just do these things and get them done and work them out through personal relationships, and otherwise it'll take forever and you never get to develop the country. And the vision was that they were doing this in the long-term best interest for these farmers, but it was unclear whether the farmers themselves saw it that way. So in any case, the party becomes a very important kind of networking venue for especially entrepreneurs and government people. In many ways, in trying to think about analogies and between that and the way in which, say, the United States developed was that this is not all that unfamiliar with basically political life in the United States. In fact, I think maybe the closest analogy I can think of would be USA, the South in the first half of the 20th century, where basically you had a single party system, in that case the Democratic Party, that brought together local business people and elites and the government and so forth, all white of course there, that basically kept stability and enabled the economy, lubricated the economy and kept it going. In many ways, at local level in China, the party functions sort of like the Democratic Party in the United States and the Deep South did in the first part of the 20th century. But of course, we know what happened in the South. There was eventually things like urbanization, high-tech economic development, as well as social movements and the civil rights movement, all sorts of things like that, that have broken that world apart in the past 50 years. But the point is that the Chinese system and the Chinese political economic system isn't all that different, isn't all that exotic, actually, and isn't all that far away from our experience today, maybe 2 generations away. And also the point is that rapid changes of the kind that Barry Naughton mentioned briefly, again, the urbanization, new kinds of economic development, new kinds of social demographics and so forth, will upset that and make it difficult to sustain this particular way of local rule into the future. So, what then will tie the party together in the future, and how will it go forward? Another set of ideas and impressions that I got from China has to do with another kind of research project I was doing about the resurgence of various kinds of religion and religiosity in China. In the case of religion, like many other cases, including economy and local politics, basically it's all being managed now in a very local, ad hoc ways, a whole variety of local arrangements that have to do with the way in which local officials interact with society and this nexus of power, that's the Communist Party and local elites. Not very well coordinated. And at the level of the party itself, they're quite concerned that there's no kind of overarching guiding ideology for this anymore. It's all by the seat of your pants, it's all ad hoc, it's all kind of uncoordinated. And it works right now because the economy has still been pretty lively and vibrant, and there's economic development, just enough to keep people satisfied enough that there's no coalescing huge social movements against the party. And it sort of works, but there's kind of concern about the way in which they can go in the future. So when I was at Fudan University, they had me give a talk actually to the local the university party branch, United Front Department, because the university is a so-called theoretical base for the party, and they wanted some ideas about theories, in my particular case, about religion and the modern world and so forth. And I told them what they actually knew, fully accepted, that the party's approach to religion is based on a classic kind of secularization theory, Marx, the opium of the people, and so forth, and religion will die out and all that, which has been, at least in social sciences, cutting-edge social science today in the West, thoroughly discredited. And one example of a way it doesn't work is in China, where the policy toward religion is basically a total failure on its own terms, because it's supposed to contain religion and keep it under control and keep it from growing, and it's actually growing like wildfire in many, many places, and indeed out of control, and intersecting with all sorts of things like ethnic and other kinds of conflict. So the policy was set up to stop that from happening based on this classic Marxist sort of secularized state. The policy is a failure, and they're trying to kind of keep stability by all sorts of ad hoc arrangements. So they're searching for a new policy. In this case of religion, the new policy, and I believe this is the case in other areas in the party, the new policy, new ideology, is actually a return to the future or a reversion to the past. Basically, the policy is, in case of religion, is sort of return to an old kind of Ming-Qing way of approaching religious affairs, in which the government leads, the teachings, religions follow, and that's it. And this leads to new forms of acceptance of all sorts of local practices, of local folk religion, much more flexibility with regard to that, much more flexibility with regard to things like Buddhism and Taoism in China than they had for a long, long time under the first phase of the communist rule. Because now some of these things are called not feudal superstition, which was the term under the old Marxist ideology, but now a new word, non-material cultural heritage. And all this is kind of a remnants of the great Chinese past. And so what it basically is, the remnants of the glory, of the brilliance of the Chinese nation. You actually saw a lot of this on display during the opening ceremonies for the Olympics last year. And so the idea is that China's a great nation with these 5,000 years of history, deep roots in the past and so forth, and that should kind of rule itself like its great rulers did in the past in many, many ways. The only problem with this is it doesn't accommodate too well in the religious case, for example, but in other cases, with things like universalizing world religions, global religions like Christianity, and for that matter, like Islam. For that matter, like globalized, universalized Buddhism, too, which gets you into Tibetan Buddhism especially. And it doesn't fit that very well, this old kind of imperial approach to things like religious affairs. And so you got a new ideology, which actually is kind of an old ideology, trying to deal with a world that's now globalized, with all sorts of outside influences and all sorts of global interdependencies. And this new nationalism doesn't, it solves some problems, but it leaves other problems hanging, especially the problems created by global cultural interdependence and interaction. And so that's a challenge that China faces, perhaps ideologically, in the coming years, that it has to find a substitute for Marxism and Leninism no one believes in. One substitute is this kind of nationalism, but then in the globalized world, this kind of nationalism itself becomes possibly irrelevant or maybe dangerous.
Well, this is a very good segue to our last speaker, Tai-Ming Chung, who's going to be talking about China's place in the world, because nationalism can certainly get you in trouble. And so Tai-Ming will talk about China's approach to national security.
Thank you. So I'm the last member of this gang of four to be talking and focusing on the security side of things. Okay, so in examining and trying to explain the resilience of Chinese communist rule over the last 60 years, a profoundly important, but I think understated reason is how the Chinese Communist Party has approached and adapted to handling security issues and security challenges. So especially in the last 30 years, where the Chinese have actually done extremely well. I mean, saying that the Chinese Communist Party has handled these security challenges well is no mean feat, because when you look at other communist and authoritarian regimes around the world itself, the handling of security has been, in many ways, a dismal record. You saw the Soviet Union and how it emphasized the importance of national security, of military strength, etc. And that led to its ultimate collapse. And many other communist and authoritarian regimes tend to be heavy-handed and focus too heavily on coercion. The Chinese Communist Party has been much more adaptable and much more able to balance security with economic development, with political modernization, with dealing with other forms of development. So what I wanted to talk about briefly is I'll look at especially the track record over the last 60 years, and I'll look at it in 3 particular stages. And I'll look at it through these 3 interwoven but distinct strands in terms of this relationship between security and regime survival and stability. The first strand that I'll look at is in terms of the relationship between security and economic development. There's a classic Chinese idea, which is we can call what is a term the Fuguo Tianbing idea, the importance of having a strong country, a rich country, and a strong army, and how to balance that relationship has been a very important and critical focus. Hu Jintao referred to this in his National Day speech yesterday, etc. The second strand that I'll talk about as well is the relationship between security and internal politics. And of course, there's also the famous dictum by Mao Zedong about the importance that power comes from the barrel of a gun. And it's important that the Communist Party must always control that gun, etc. And then the last strand, which is very much linked, is the role of external security and how the military and the national security establishment is trying to deal with that, as well as it balances these other strands. So those are the 3 strands. So let's look at that from the first stage of China's development over the last 6 years, and that's the first 30 years of Maoist rule under Mao Zedong. When we look at these 3 strands, the Chinese leadership got it very wrong when it came to dealing with this relationship between security and regime survival. During the first 30 years of Chinese communist rule, there was what we can say is the militarization of Chinese politics, of Chinese economics, of Chinese society, of worrying about external threats, because this was an extremely dangerous phase in China's dealing with the rest of the world, with the Cold War, with the threats of invasion from the outside world. And so what you had was an extensive militarization right up until the end of the 1970s. And by the late 1970s, China, in many ways, resembled more like what North Korea is like today than what we saw. Then the pivotal change happened, and this is the second stage, is the arrival of Deng Xiaoping. And it's important to know that in terms of the sequencing of the events that we talk about with economic reforms, with the open door policy, all of that was made possible because Deng Xiaoping decided we have to step away from this militarization of Chinese society, of the Chinese economy, of having this Cold War, insular, shut off from the rest of the world mentality. And before he began to push with economic reforms, etc., he went and told the military, we're not going to continue with our policies because it's failed. We cannot continue to focus on military modernization or resources going to that particular area. So then what he begins to do is that he says we have to demilitarize. And so what you begin is to this dismantling of the massive military industrial complex, the reduction of the role of the military in politics. So you get this gradual withdrawal back into barracks, etc. And you begin to say we want to have a much more peaceful relationship with the rest of the world, the focus on peaceful economic development and of opening up and having good relations with the West, and with other countries. And so you see this pendulum swings from militarization in the Maoist period over to the other end towards a much more enlightened, peaceful development approach. And this defines China's focus during the 1980s and the early part of the 1990s. This pendulum swing from one end to the other. And then we get on to the third stage, which we are at today. And this is from sort of the early mid-1990s to the present, where this pendulum then begins to swing back more to the middle, where there's now this reconsideration of a much more balanced relationship between economic development and the importance of having a strong security and military. And in many ways, this has been the hallmark of the rule of Jiang Zemin and of Hu Jintao. And this is because under Deng Xiaoping, there was a lot of people, especially within the military, who thought they swung too far, that you had a prosperous and developing economic system, but you had a very emaciated and very weak military. And so you had these major threats. Began from 1989 with Tiananmen Square, that the military then begins to have more influence, at least in terms of arguing for budgets, etc. Then you have things like the Gulf War, and most important, then you have the threat from Taiwan, the issue of sovereignty and the possibility that Taiwan might secede. And so you have this concern within the leadership that you need to have a strong military. And the question always had been, could China, with its economic development, begin to shift resources towards its military modernization? Deng Xiaoping had said that they could do it, but they had to wait much longer. But the Taiwan issue, in many ways, has pushed this. That there's this swing over the last decade or so where military budgets have increased, where we see with the National Day Parade, it's like an extensive array of new hardware, of new doctrine, of this sense of pride about what the military is. And the military is being like the importance of having a military power commensurate with China's economic strength and its standing in the world. And so as we go forward, this is the relationship that we see between security and the longevity and the continuation of the Chinese state, that you have a much more balanced equation when it comes to this Fuguo Qianbing, the importance of having the emphasis on both a strong military as well as a rich nation. Oh, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ty. Before we open it up to the audience, I thought maybe we'd try to get a little discussion occurring among the panelists. So I'd like to throw out an issue that maybe Barry and Dick, but Ty too, could comment on. What about the problem of inequality? In China, Chinese media, China's leaders are always talking about polarization. They seem very worried about increases in inequality with this rapid growth. Do you think that's a danger? And how does China rank up compared to other countries in its level of inequality? And what are the political consequences of this?
Well, let's just start with how China rates in comparative terms. I mean, it is certainly true that China has gone from being, in the 1980s, one of the most equal societies on Earth in terms of income distribution to being relatively unequal in comparative terms. It has more inequality than the United States and more than what we might think of as the average middle-income country. Now, on the other hand, it's also a big country with a lot of diversity. So in that sense, we'd expect it to be somewhat more unequal. Clearly, inequality is a big problem. I guess when I think of it as a political problem, my inclination is to think of the concern for inequality as a kind of a somewhat safer way to talk about the deep concerns that people have about the lack of legitimacy of wealth, that people are not so much concerned that there is wealth and that there are wealth and poor disparities, but I think people are deeply concerned that many of the wealthy people they see got there through their connections, their links to the government and to the party, and naturally that makes them very concerned and unhappy.
Yeah, as I understand it, in China, the rate of inequality is indeed, as you say, higher than the United States. It's lower than many Latin American countries, lower than Brazil and most countries in the southern part of Latin America. The issue has to do not just with the quantity of inequality, if you will, but of the way it affects different sectors of society, perhaps diversely. And the way in which that has an impact on the nature of citizenship in China. So a major problem, for example, in a city like Shanghai, where it was, all of cities now, is there's a very, very large workforce of migrant laborers. And they do all the simple work, and all the waiters in restaurants, all the cooks, all the basic retails, all these migrant workers. They work for very, very low wages, and of course they also work in these manufacturing factories throughout the country at very, very low wages. The problem with the migrant workers, one problem is not just the amount of money that they get, but the kind of access they get or don't get to public services. So if you're a migrant to a city like Shanghai, they're making some changes now, but basically a low-level migrant has no access to things like hospitals, to public schools, and so forth. And so they're residents of the city and not even actually counted in official statistics, like how many people there are in Shanghai. They're residents of the city, but they're not citizens of the city. And so this gap between one's life circumstance and actual citizenship, practical citizenship, is, I think, a very, very serious problem that in the long run, unless it's resolved, it's going to create lots of problems. And there are obstacles to doing it, and there's will to help fix the problem, but it's going to take a long time. Also, there's a problem, the way in which stratification of inequality can then congeal into something like almost like a caste system. So at the very top level, there's something in the oligarchy almost like an aristocracy. The people, they intermarry, they interact with each other, they live a world that's in many ways in a bubble outside the way in which ordinary people live. I know people at that realm, and it's a good life, but it's pretty isolated. At the lower level, there's debate about this among sociologists, but people like Sun Liping, he's a famous public intellectual now in China, sociologist at Tsinghua, says that basically if you're a peasant, a farmer, there's almost no way that you can really move much beyond that. Okay, so society is not as open, even though there are opportunities, but not as open even as the United States. And so there's the possibility of people congealing and being stuck in a certain kind of status. When that happens, you have the potential for serious kinds of class conflict and serious problems unless that's resolved. And so this is a challenge that China has faced going forward.
You know, it's often said that that things are going well in China, the Communist Party is doing great, but so long as the economy keeps growing, but if there are economic problems, watch out. Well, we had some economic problems. Growth rates did decline, and a lot of migrant laborers had to be sent home, and there was real distress in some parts of China. And yet it looks to me as if politically it really didn't even cause a serious hiccup. That's kind of a puzzle. How would you explain that? Anybody got any?
Well, I would say, first of all, it ain't over yet. So
Okay.
let's see what happens when it's over. But also, you would expect that in the initial response to an economic crisis, people are going to be overwhelmingly concerned with adapting their own household's survival strategies. I wouldn't expect that kind of short-term response. And now things certainly on the surface look a lot better, so I think the issues are clearly pushed off in that sense.
So the downturn didn't last very long.
If you have declared it over, I mean, it's certainly over for now.
Well, what's your view of that?
Well, I think in the Chinese economy, like the American economy, although, you know, our first take has got to be great. We've come out of the worst of a really serious challenge, but there are many respects in which we haven't found our feet yet. And I think for China's exports are still way down, although they are growing again. And growth has been so dependent on government investment, and you can't run a whole economy indefinitely on just expanding government investment. So I think there are a lot of challenges still ahead.
Ty?
I just want to follow up and ask a question with Barry, seeing that he's doing all the heavy lifting here. It's like, do you see, especially with all these economic problems, that you may get the shift within Chinese economic thinking and how the policymakers respond? I mean, you were talking in your speech about these legacies issues, about the importance of the state and the tensions with the market. And there seems to be quite a bit of debate going on between nationalists and conservatives who say perhaps we should not be going as much faster on economic liberalization and retrench back a little.
There certainly are people saying that, and at the same time, there are people answering and saying that the long-run solution to the economic challenge we have right now is further demonopolization, allowing the economy to evolve another stage towards a more private, more smaller scale economy in many ways, where presumably consumption would have a greater opportunity to grow. It's been growing pretty well given the impact of the crisis, but where consumption could grow even more. So I mean, in that sense, in the early days of reform, sort of all the economic issues pushed towards liberalization. So that was easy in some sense it was still challenging, but pragmatists could adapt in that way. Now we've got these conflicting forces, but at least some of them still push us towards a more liberal and open society, I think.
So Dick, during the economic crash in China, how did it affect people's lives?
Well, you know,
In Shanghai, where you saw that.
I was part of, in Shanghai at the university, we were in a kind of a middle-class bubble, and it's doing pretty comfortable. Things are even cheaper now, so you could live well, eat well, and so forth. A serious problem, though, a very serious problem that the government is very concerned about, is in fact lack of employment opportunities for young people, for students. Even at a absolutely first-class university like Fudan, a lot of the graduating seniors can't find jobs, and at lower-ranked universities, even worse. And so I think their fear was that you get a combination of dissatisfied young intellectuals and you know, angry farmers and so migrant workers. This could be a very potent mix. In my neighborhood, there were signs all up about especially counseling centers for young people to go try to find jobs and stuff like that. But it's an indication of how difficult it was. So you know, so that's a problem. At the top levels, I think this in terms of your leadership, you know, divisions, besides divisions among different factions and top leadership, there are divisions among different bureaucracies, different agencies about how to cope and deal with the situation. I also had some conversations with people at Beijing in the Ministry of Civil Affairs, writing new, actually pretty liberal guidelines for how groups can form and so-called civil society can develop. And they were pretty open and pretty flexible, pretty liberal. But then I found out that what happens is that the Public Security Bureau comes and says, you can't do that, right? And the Public Security Bureau always trumps all these liberal things. And so there's a division within the government itself between the public security and to some degree the Propaganda Bureau and things like civil affairs and so forth. And different people congregate in these different bureaus. And this year especially, the Public Security Bureau have been riding high. They're very worried about instability and anniversaries, and they're really strong. Maybe after this National Day, it'll calm down, although, I wouldn't bet on it.
Yeah, and there are more leaders from these security bureaucracies at the very top reaches of power in the Communist Party right now in the Politburo than ever before. And I think that does reflect the kind of nervousness about survival and potential domestic threats to Communist Party rule. I want to open it up to the audience, and so the floor is open for your questions.
Thank you. My question has to do with the future of ethnic minorities in China, particularly the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. I mean, that region in the 1940s was really underdeveloped, and after, by the 80s and everything, China really started to invest a lot in the development of the West and everything. But one problem is that, particularly with Uyghur culture, I mean, they're so different. They have a different language and religion. There's been a lot of limitations in different periods about Islam and the respect of their culture. So what do you see the future of minorities like the Uyghurs? Will they have to assimilate in order to not be labeled separatists, or how will they be able to reap the success of China's economic development?
That's a great question, because just in this past year, ethnic conflicts have really reared their head in China with Tibet and Xinjiang. So I'm sure in Beijing there is a lot of discussion about their approach to these ethnic minorities, which of course are a relatively small percentage of the population in China. That's, I suppose, an advantage of China, that it's a pretty ethnically homogeneous country. But on the other hand, they're concentrated in these areas at the periphery of China. And so whether or not the current approach is economic development, having Han people settle in those areas, and basically a very repressive political approach toward the religion, toward any independent expression of the cultural and religious beliefs of those folks. And it's clearly not working.
I have a question about the Taiwan question. My question, I guess this would be directed for Professor Shirk. In light of the recent political developments in Taiwan, the 2008 administration change from the DPP and ABN back to the KMT and Ma Ying-jeou, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on prospects for a change in the status quo in light of recent developments, and whether or not Ma Ying-jeou and the KMT have the political credibility consider their poor handling of the typhoon disaster and the floods this summer.
Well, I think the people in Beijing, the people in Washington, and Ma Ying-jeou share an interest in having him restore his political support in Taiwan. Because since Ma Ying-jeou was elected, we've gotten this very positive dynamic going across the strait. And the U.S. has just stepped out of it quite happily. And we've got this positive tit for tat going in which the two sides are finding ways to reassure one another, strengthening economic ties and having high-level dialogues. And I think it really speaks well for the current leadership in Beijing, that they've been able to take advantage of this opportunity by changing their approach to Taiwan, to be more to win the hearts and minds of the people of Taiwan, instead of trying to intimidate them through force and being dogmatic about the formulas that are used of how to talk about the relationship between China and Taiwan. So right now we have a positive dynamic underway. It's hard to know how far it can go. I've been told that Hu Jintao wants to make this his political legacy. Now, Jiang Zemin wanted to make Taiwan reunification his political legacy, but in my opinion, he handled it very poorly. He was in a big hurry. He set deadlines and tried to put pressure on Taiwan. And of course, he had a government in Taiwan that wasn't interested in playing ball. But now, Hu Jintao seems to be handling the Taiwan issue with great tact, great flexibility. And so I think all of us who see this as very, very important, not just to Chinese people, but to American national security. You know, the last thing in the world we want to do is have to intervene to defend Taiwan in some military clash. So stabilizing the situation in the way they're doing, I think leadership on both sides earns high marks from me.
I guess I'm a little bit somewhat more concerned and pessimistic. So politically, it's all fine and dandy. But when we see, I guess, the structural security dynamics there, not a great deal has changed. China continues with its military build-up. We see with the military parade yesterday, while the focus was very much on the domestic audience, there was also a clear signal to Taiwan and the West that China has the military capabilities, especially in terms of their missiles, etc., to be able to deal with any unexpected contingencies across the Taiwan Strait. So Beijing still, I guess, when they want to deal with Taiwan now, they want to do it from a position of strength. And they want to say that you can't go back to before Mao, to the Cheng Shui-bian, because China now carries a very big stick when it comes to the dealing with Taiwan.
Yeah, of course, what's on the agenda is whether or not this flexibility that Beijing is showing will actually extend to doing something like capping or withdrawing its missiles across the strait from Taiwan. That is a demand of Ma Ying-jeou and the Taiwan people. They feel intimidated by those missiles. And previously, back in the late 70s, China took unilateral military actions to reassure the people of Taiwan when they took a lot of the forces that had been based there and moved them away from Fujian as a positive signal. So it could happen again, and I'd say that it will be really the test of just how flexible Beijing is.
My name is Wenjing. I am a new student in IRPS. My question is for Professor Susan Shirk. I know you have a lot of experience in U.S. government. I'm wondering that after Obama stood in front of U.S. government, comparing his attitude to Middle East and Russia, we haven't seen a lot of positive message sent from him and his mission. So I'm wondering that what's the new challenge and the new opportunities between two countries, speaking of U.S. and China relationship?
Well, I think that you will see, and we are seeing, a great deal of continuity in U.S. policy toward China. And that's no surprise, because over the past 7 administrations, really they've taken basically the same approach of trying to develop a good foundation for cooperation, preventing any risk of a Cold War between U.S. and China, and at the same time as maintaining our military strength if all our efforts turn out to fail. So I think Obama is basically taking the same approach. We haven't really seen a full-fledged Obama administration policy yet, but the president will be traveling to China in November, and you're going to see a lot more speeches and statements from the administration. The one thing to watch out for is the climate change issue. Climate change issue, we had high hopes, could be an new area for cooperation between these 2 large countries that are the biggest emitters. But it's going to be very, very difficult. And there's a risk that it could turn into a new area of conflict in which the Chinese people believe that America is using the issue to try to slow down China's growth and contain its rise, and Americans believing that China refuses to cooperate so that it can rise and surpass the United States.
Hello, my name is Tomo Ito. I'm a first-year grad student here. What do you think the relationship between China and Japan will be in the coming years now that Japan had experienced a major power shift in the ruling party in 50 years?
The current leadership in Beijing is trying to improve relations with Japan, just as it's trying to improve relations with Taiwan. In the past, these have been very difficult foreign policy issues for China because of nationalist public opinion. They're trying to get beyond that and to adopt a more pragmatic approach in order to stabilize relations and prevent any risk of inadvertent military conflict, which could occur between China and Japan because their navies and their merchant ships and their drilling ships come very close to one another in the East China Sea, where there's contested energy resources under the sea. So I think they'll try to build a good relationship with the new government in Taiwan, and we don't yet know what the new, Japan, and we don't know what the new government's position, attitude, and approach really will be yet.
I had a question about the U.S. just created a coalition, if you can call it a coalition, with Russia to deal with Iran. Do you see China and the U.S. doing something similar, some sort of alliance against North Korea?
You want Ty? Let Ty talk, yeah.
I don't see that any type of alliance structure between China and the U.S. dealing with North Korea. I mean, of course, the 2 countries are working within the framework of the 6-party talks to tackle the North Korean issue, because it's in both their interests, as well as the countries in the rest of the region, to halt and to roll back North Korea's efforts to get nuclear weapons itself. And I see that there's been very active and good cooperation, and China's been very much taken an important leadership role in that as convening the 6-party talks. But I think there are also real limits to how far that they can go itself. China has a number of shared interests when it comes to dealing with North Korea with the US, but it also has its own distinct interests that it's very keen to have good relations with North Korea because of the concerns of instability and refugee outflows there, and it doesn't want to see regime change in North Korea or to see a major change in the political system. So given that, there are constraints to how far China will go towards cooperation with the US and the international community. And you see that the Chinese have been very careful in terms of economic sanctions, despite what the North Koreans have been doing, especially since the spring with its second nuclear tests and its various missile tests. So I think China wants to work with the US through a more multilateral setting, but there are very significant constraints over the longer term in dealing with North Korea.
My question goes to China's economic reform. Since the last 30 years, we've seen that China is quite successful in the economic reform, but I'd like you to make a comparison between the former Soviet Union. So both of former Soviet Union and China stick to the market economy, but when China stick to the market economy, it just go to the economic reform. But the former Soviet Union, it firstly stick to some transformation or changing in the political system. So as you address a lot of problem in China's democracy, in China's political system, but what's your prospect about China's success? So is it more rational, like China, to firstly build up a strong economy and then seek to some problem like the inequality situation in the country? Okay, thank you.
Barry?
Actually, I thought that was more for you on the grounds that I had already evaluated the economy as being mostly successful, and the question was that a reasonable strategy to concentrate on the economy first and defer some of the institutional and political questions until later? Is that a fair accounting of the question?
Well, you know, we don't have so many cases here. So what happens is we look at China and the Soviet Union, and I think it's pretty obvious that China is the more successful experiment. So certainly the people in China and the party leaders who talk about China as compared with Russia make that point all the time. Russia is kind of a negative model. So I think that it's true that a more gradual approach, rather than a big bang in which suddenly the system just sort of implodes, has worked much better. The question of political values, and it has led to a lot of political change, mostly in the realm of individual freedom. I mean, nobody has said this today. I think it's really worth emphasizing, especially from my perspective, comparing the China I saw in the bad old days with the China of today. And, you know, people can decide where to live, what job to have, you know, what clothes to wear, what music to listen to, who to marry. You know, it's just a very different world than the world of living under Mao, where the controls of your personal life were so intrusive. So all that is very positive. You know, the question I think that everyone has addressed here is there's still some uncertainty about how you move to the next phase and whether or not the party will be able to adapt. And will it decide, for example, to introduce a truly autonomous legal system, a free press, civil society? Will those folks at the Civil Affairs Bureau have a greater influence after 2009? So these are the things that we're all watching to see and hoping. One more question here. Yes?
We've been touching on the idea of pendulums all night, and I want to reemphasize that. Leading up to last night's big performance, there's been two major influences for the anniversary. One is very deep contraction in civil liberties, and that was in the media, of course, in public dissent, but there was also a big propping up of the economy. And much of that occurred with money that actually went into the stock market, money that went to speculative real estate markets. And I'm aware of two powerful and short-term predictions. And one is that there's going to be, and one is very optimistic, the other is pessimistic. One is that civil liberties are going to expand after today. And the other one is that we're going to see something like a bubble burst in the market. And I'd like a comment on that.
Anybody like to comment on that?
Well, I'll take the second. I'd say the first one. Anybody who makes a prediction is foolish, because we really don't know in terms of whether the sharp downturn in civil liberties in the last year is going to be sustained or not. Clearly, it's really troubling and disappointing. You know, on the economic front, I think while those concerns are real, people who extrapolate from the concerns to say, oh, there's going to be another crash, or somehow the growth maintenance policies are somehow phony, or it's going to all unravel. I think this is not true. Now, that doesn't mean there can't be a serious correction. I mean, as I said before, we're not out of the woods. I don't think this crisis is over by any means. But the Chinese economy has lots of flexibility and lots of adaptability. And so I think there's still lots of scope for exit strategies to work that could lead to maybe not 8% growth, but to healthy growth over the next couple of years if choices are made, if tough choices are made.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for a very interesting evening. I knew that we up here would have a good time doing this together, and indeed we have, and that's largely due to your excellent questions and your coming here tonight to join with us in discussing these puzzles. This is the way Barry and I talk about the puzzles of Chinese development that we're continuing to work on trying to figure out. So we hope that you'll come back and join us for future events here at IRPS on China and Japan and other Asian countries and on Latin America. And have a good evening, and thanks very much, especially to the panelists.